And we're rolling. So, I would like you to talk to me about the painting that you've done called Prayer, and tell me what the inspiration for it was, how it came about.
Yeah, so like the rest of my paintings from this series that I'm showing at the London Art Fair, they're all from a week or 4 days when I took my grandma, who's 80 years old today, this year to Rome. And Prayer is about a prayer sort of alcove in the middle of the Basilica in Rome, St. Peter's, which is the biggest church in the city. And there are candles lit for people. They're electric candles, so that there's no risk of fire. And it's just taken from that moment, seeing my cousin in a moment of reflection following the death of her grandfather. But you wouldn't necessarily know that when you look at the piece. So it's taken as a snapshot from my experience of visiting that place. But it's much more about a moment of quietness and reflection. The warm yellow that I've used in the back as a wash, from which to begin the painting, is very much for me about that, contemplating together, and just how much doubt might be involved in prayer. So I was kind of interested in showing a fragment of a person.
And I found the most interesting in that composition of the painting, which is you see a slither of a person and then this bright yellow background. And I wondered why, you could have put the entire person there or half the person, but it's really just on the fringe. Why did you decide to do it like this?
Yeah, I mean, in some of my paintings, the figure is in the centre or just off centre, and you get the feeling that it's about them. But sometimes the figure disappears completely, and you're the figure, the viewer becomes the kind of protagonist, and they're invited to step into the work.
Yeah.
So I feel with Prayer, I kind of wanted to have it both ways, where you're seeing it over somebody else's shoulder.
Yeah.
But it's not really about that person, because I guess that's kind of what it's like when you visit a church. It opens up this interior space.
It is very interesting, I find, because with that sort of representation, you're really clearly drawn in. And I don't know if I understood the painting well, but it looks like the yellow light is behind grills.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered again, that creates that sense of space, of separation, and also that these layers on the paintings. And again, I'm curious about that choice of composition.
Yeah, I guess a painting often works, or I quite enjoy my paintings leading people into recesses. So whatever's in the foreground will then point towards something in the middle, like the grate, and then that leads on or creates the suggestion that there's something beyond that.
Yeah.
And I think, the physical space of a church has many alcoves or many chapels and rooms within rooms. So I was kind of thinking about what it feels to be in a space like that, where there are lots of kind of windows or frames through which you can view other sort of interiors, and that's quite spiritual, I guess, like peeking into some other place. But yeah, I think I love the idea that it's not always defined, or I leave it to the viewer to complete what that other space might be like. It's not necessarily my intention to, situate it in a place where they can't then bring their own imaginative kind of idea. The yellow might also just be the candlelight. Yes. It might be the glow of the warmth of that, and the love maybe that those candles represent.
Yeah. I wanted to speak also about Selfie Amongst the Ruins. So you mentioned that you'd been with your grandmother in Rome, and so I'm wondering whether that character in the center of the painting is your grandma?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's kind of funny where when you interact with various generations, or you go on holiday with various generations, you can't help but, I guess maybe with this painting I wanted something a bit more humorous, and maybe it's a trap that one falls into, but I have to imagine my grandma somehow representing age and representing a kind of generation, and then my younger cousins who are all Zoomers representing a kind of new sensibility. And you know, people have gone to Rome and have, you know, done this kind of tourist trail on the Via Sacra and the Via Appia for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yes.
So I was just playing with that, and you know, the idea of the sublime. People began being really fascinated by ruins and excavating ruins in Rome, all the way from the 16th century until the 19th, and it was sort of a craze, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was kind of interested in how my grandma's waiting to be photographed, but my cousin is actually photographing herself. And
the different expectations you were saying between your grandma waiting to be taken in photo, and then your cousin taking a photo of herself.
Yeah.
And I think there's also, you also mentioned the fact that for hundreds of years it's been something that people have done, going on this trip around Rome, and very much, you know, from the Grand Tour all the way to today, and now you're placing this painting very much on the here and now because of the phone, because of the selfie. This is what you see in Rome constantly.
Yeah. It's so true. You know, when I was making that painting, I had a Fuseli drawing in the back of my mind, which is like the artist stunned by the grandeur of ancient fragments or something, and it's just a little sketch that he made where in the Capitol Museum you have these huge feet and heads of the colossi, and he's just a little figure like this, sort of crying because it's so epic. You know, how could a modern artist ever represent or replicate that kind of the grandeur of the past? But I don't know, I don't really relate to it in that way, or for me it's much more about the experience of visiting these ruins that, you know, one really imagines what it must have been like, but there's so much missing. You know, it's like a bone yard or a landscape where, so much is missing. I can't really imagine what it must have been like. But yeah, for me it's the living people in my life are the most important form of inspiration I could have, you know, and they're the way I connect with that landscape and that history. Yeah.
And it's the terrain of your exploration as opposed to the archaeological sites and those ruins. I think you always, even though people might be, like we've said in prayer, on the side, it's always around people and that experience that you have either as the viewer or as the subject. It's very important. I don't know that I've seen any of your paintings without a person in it. Are there any such?
Yeah, there's Night Walk to the Cinema, which has no one there.
Yes.
And there are several shutters as well, which is just a lamp or a lamppost behind a shutter, so we're inside a building. So there are some, but there aren't that many. And yeah, I think there's always a difference, isn't it, between no figure and one figure, but then also between one figure and two figures. I was just discussing this with a great friend, Ross Head, who always paints one figure, or has been just one figure at the moment, and as soon as you begin to pop two in, like I have in Selfie Among the Ruins, it changes the dynamic so that you're actually drawn into what's going on in their world. You know, it's less about you as a person, you know, you as a viewer, you're kind of seeing their reality, or it's like a little theatre or a little movie that you're being drawn into.
Very interesting. And you know, that made me think of the paintings of Christine Onkawa, who is going to be the other artist featured in the London Art Fair. What you're saying around the colours and the stories and the interplay. Well, Christine, and we can see behind us one of her painting, which is called Solar Flare, is all about emotions, is all about colours. You're very much about narrative and also about emotions and about colours. So you have very different styles, but I do find that in some elements they meet. What are your reflections on the work of Christine? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think it's always, I don't know, it's that age-old division, I guess, that we have now between abstract and figurative, and what it means to be either of those things. But I think for artists themselves, if you're an abstract painter, you appreciate lines and marks just as much as a figurative painter would. And if you're a figurative painter, I think you end up appreciating structure and colour and like an abstract definition of space just as much as if you were an abstract artist. So I think you actually end up sharing quite a lot in terms of how you construct a visual piece that makes coherent sense. You know, it might not, in Christine's case, be a story or a narrative, but it still makes the eye move in specific ways. And I definitely think about that. You know, her mark making, she has often a monochrome kind of plane and then gestures that crop up and lead us, or, you know, we're left to piece all those little gestures that are kind of floating together. And I think that is, I really love that. And I try to do not something similar, but I do try and give people pinpoints that then they can construct a story out of, or that they can sort of see if they can combine it into a coherent whole. So I think that's very similar, or that's like a similar strategy. And then I just think her use of colour is very coherent. You know, she's not throwing a gazillion colours at you. I feel like Christine's monochromes are quite powerful because they're mostly about one main mood with a few contrasting accents within the same canvas. And I think that's something I try and do as well. So basing the painting, maybe not on a singular colour, but using colour to simplify or reduce the emotion, you know, to make it really strong and simple, can be very useful, I think.
There's one of your paintings which is called Morning Light, is it? Where I think that use of light is also really made me think of how she uses colour. So for you, it's the light filtering through a window in the morning, casting on a sleeping person, and you can see the outline of that person. And sometimes I see in Christine's work outlines that where she uses a certain emphasis in colour. And so I'm very much thinking about bringing, there's a painting from her which is called Sunset. It's in the dark blacks and greys and with touches of red. And to me there's elements. There's that and Moonlight, which is also one of her, and it's more in the blues, which I think is really showing how, in a figurative way, you're using that light and those different that texture also that it gives, and how she does that in an abstract way.
That's interesting. Yeah. I also think that, you know, now that we're talking about it, I think that Christine has quite a primary palette. You know, it's very black, white, yellow, red, blue. Yes. And I'm one of those people, I love that because I'm also really excited about primaries. I was thinking in my painting, Summer Storm, where it's about 3 individuals all in different brightly coloured ponchos, then it's not quite the primary colours, but it's blue, red and green, and just the joy and the kind of radiance that those unmixed colours have, where they're, I guess people say that you can find any colour or you can mix any colour from that primary triad, and I love that. There's something quite powerful about that, and I feel with Christine it motors her painting.
There's something else that motors your paintings in particular that I'd like to talk about, which is your poetry. Because I think if there are 2 very strong elements for you, and these are those very close relationships with the people that surround you, and we can talk a bit more about that, but also your writing, the writing of others, particularly in poetry, and you often use that and either pair it with painting or distill it in some of your painting. Can you talk to me a bit more about that and how you use poetry?
I think for me, writing poems can be a way of very organically coming up with certain images or sensory details that I remember or that I half remember from my life. So I've always written poems, and I've also taken notes, like fragmentary notes about experiences. I've always been terrible at keeping a diary, but this kind of disjunct and concentrated form is something that suits me better, I think. So then when I come into the studio, I'm able to create something, because I guess what I really struggled with first was complexity in a painting. But if I take my poems as models, I don't actually have to do that much with one painting. It's just going to say one thing or be about a specific moment. And that kind of fragmentary or lyric quality of poems makes me relax a bit when I paint, and makes me feel like I can remember a memory, or I can latch onto a specific image that then will help me make a painting. So that's how I began, but I think now I have a bit more of a flexible idea. So I sometimes show a painting and a poem. I sometimes start with a poem and then turn it into a painting. And I think with these works, I actually began straight away with the paintings, because I'd literally had the experience, then painted it the following 2 weeks. And now that it's settled a bit in my mind, I'm going to create poems from the idea of painting and the experience itself. So I think just moving in between those 2 mediums I find really helpful, basically, and it gives me a certain kind of freedom and flexibility, and it helps me kind of self-reflect, I guess.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying, where sometimes it's good to latch on to a fragment or an idea and not try to be as super expensive and really get very close. And I think there's that in lots of your paintings, and it doesn't mean that it's simple either, but I think it's a very definite point of view and a choice of perspective as well. A bit like what you've done on Opulence, looking at the marble floor quite specifically and then placing these feet on top. So that's interesting. We've touched on it a little bit already, but you tend to paint people who are very close to you, as opposed to a stranger passing by, even if those people then becomes a portrayal, maybe some more generic, but you paint them, you don't paint from photography. I'd like to hear more about why this particular choice of subject matter.
Yeah, of course. So I don't ever paint from an image, and I don't take my own photography. All my documentation is either just in my mind's eye or in the fragments of poetry I write. So I feel that the people that I paint, I do have to spend time with and I do have to live with, because that's how I can kind of remember them. So there's a repetitive aspect to it where I tend to, I've always painted, for example, my sister, my middle sister. I've painted her since I was 16, and we've shared a bedroom for the majority of my life, so she's the person I would see when I fell asleep and then when I woke up. And I just think that for me, making figurative art about people is about being really honest about the people that you know well enough to represent. So I feel that what I do is try and capture their specific ways of being in the world, because they're the people that create value and meaning in my life. So it becomes, I don't think about it as being documentary-like.
No, and it's never hyper-representative either.
Yeah.
It's usually an attitude more.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's really interesting about this idea of having a muse, and I don't limit myself to one muse, but I think the way I use, or the way I paint people does remind me of that maybe slightly older idea of having somebody real be there for you that then you draw inspiration from, and that is also kind of a collaborator. And so even though the people I paint aren't actually with me in the studio, they do collaborate with me in my life. I think it's almost a political question as well, who can you represent and who do you have the right to represent? And so I only represent the people that I know or I feel I have the right to represent.
Somewhat a perfect stranger?
No, I don't think so. I could maybe paint somebody if they paid me to do it, but I'm not sure how I would feel about that, or that's a bit kind of against the kind of contract of what I do or what my representation is for.
And have you ever asked your sitters if they mind? Because if you're painting them again and again and again, I feel like their image or self is being represented in that way, is it taken away from them?
Well, I think that what's interesting is that I think because of the style, it's not hyper-realistic, and I also don't name my sitters, so I think there's a degree of remove where they've inspired me, but it might not look exactly like them, but I do tell them, and I think that is fine. They are happy with it. Otherwise there would be some interesting discussions, and I might start painting other things. Yes.
There'd be lots of paintings on the
cutting
floor.
Lots of still lives and lots of brushing out. But it is interesting. Yeah.
Now you've just completed your MA at Slade. And I know this is something that you've worked super hard for, and I wondered whether, how it's changed you and whether it's delivered everything you expected it to deliver.
Yes, I think it's changed me in far more ways than I would have expected, and primarily it's because I didn't study art at undergrad, so I didn't know what to expect at a master's level and going to a fine arts school. It was a big surprise. I think apart from all the technical skills and, contemporary art knowledge I've gained, which I was expecting to gain, I've actually gained a lot of trust in myself, which is kind of interesting. How my own emotions or how my own way of making art is valid and can be shared, and also holding on to, I think a lot of my work has a sense of childishness or elements of childhood or crafting or clumsiness that I've kind of learnt to love or not get rid of, and resonates, I think, with quite a lot of people. And yeah, I just think also that ambition is what it's taught me, that I don't have to paint one specific kind of work. And that I've been so grateful for, you know, because when you exit into the commercial world, you feel like you've got to be a specific kind of painter. And I definitely don't feel that way. I feel very free and excited about the things I'm making. So I couldn't really ask for more, I feel.
And do you have a sense of what marks you out amongst your peer artists? I mean, it's a very tough question to self-assess in this way against, you know, a number of artists. But for me, there's definitely very different qualities of your work. And although you say you don't feel like you're typecast in a certain type of work, I do think that when I look at Beatriz Santos, I know that it's a Beatriz Santos and no one else is.
Yes, I've always had that though. I've never managed to escape myself. You know, I went on a residency to the Prado a year ago, and a fellow artist, Rob from the Royal Academy, was looking through my sketchbook and he's like, "Oh dear, you've Beatrizified everything." And I'm like, "Oh no," you know, like I think that is just, some people have a problem of finding their own style, and for me that's never been the issue. For me it's like just expanding my ability to express different things, express different moods, perfect or professionalize certain ways of working, you know. So yeah, I think that's.
And versus the others, say, you know, to make the universe a bit less daunting, but say amongst your peer at the Slade through your year, how do you think your practice differs from theirs?
I think maybe this idea that it can be very traditional and very odd at the same time. So I think lots of people are working in figurative painting, and we're having like a renaissance. We have had a renaissance in figurative painting. You know, there's so much of it now, it's almost, you know, too much and overwhelming. But I think the ability to match figurative painting and traditional modes of representation with something that's much more about found objects and salvaging things and installation can be quite interesting, you know, and I think also just framings, types of frames. I'm really interested in how my works might be. There are frames within my work, so when you see a painting of a gallery with many different paintings, but also, you know, holes to look through, and how we're all kind of conditioned to look at things in specific ways. So I think I'm trying to think about the ways in which we look at objects, or the ways in which we look at painting, and my work is kind of always exploring that as well.
I also find that your work always can appear simple to begin with, but I think if you start digging into it, you see, these other frames. So this is Green Gallery, and you start to, and then you uncover the layers within it. So, but what they're amazing at is proposing this image with great simplicity and appeal. So it's easy to get in, but then the more you engage with it, the more you'll start to see things.
I'm glad you say that, because I think why I prefer to be a painter rather than a poet. Frank O'Hara says the opposite, why I'm a painter rather than why I'm a poet rather than a painter. But the reason I prefer one over the other is I think with painting you have that immediacy, and I love it when people don't feel daunted by what they see, that it's a very particular life, but that through that particularity people feel welcome, and feel like there's a place for them to kind of view and connect with the artwork.
Yeah, completely. And I think that brings me on to think about what, you know, for the London Art Fair, we will be presenting your work, especially painted for the art fair, but also bring the work of Christine Ankawa, who is going to be 80 next year and has had long, illustrious career. So you are at different ends of your journeys into art. And so thinking about what are the challenges for you and your generation of artists versus that generation of artists, what do you think? What are the differences? What do you see as your challenges today?
Yeah, I think the way that the art market works at the moment, where young artists feel so much pressure to produce, to be visible on social media, to expose themselves, I think is very difficult to navigate. It's hard to feel like you can have time to grow and to experiment, to close yourself off and find a private place or to develop and then come forward with new things. So I think for me, I'd say, social media makes it really difficult, the hyper saturation and the feeling that there's so much art, whereas I think maybe artists of the past were really hungry for some kind of art, anything really. So I think, that for me is definitely a tricky balance to achieve.
Yeah, I think so, and I think you're absolutely right that it's certainly thinking about Christine and her personal journey. She didn't get into the art world until she was 30. She'd been painting a bit on her own, but then at 30 she goes into art school and then she starts to paint it. Then she's discovered. So it's later in life and she's had other experiences and she has had a chance to mature. Feels like now we're accelerating very much, and so it's tough. But I also think the other challenge is just in being women artists, because although there's more recognition of the talent of women, it's still, when you look at, I'm sure when we look at who is exhibited in the art fair, we'll still see that there's many more men than women. So I want to do my bit to change that balance.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think it is really important. I think though we are kind of in a golden age where I couldn't feel more confident about being a female artist, and I'm very aware and grateful for that privilege, because I went to art school and I was taught by 3 incredible female artists who had to, push to be recognised in their generation. And I think painting is changing, it isn't really male coded anymore in the same way that it has been in the past. So yeah, I'm very lucky to feel that way.
I think it's lucky. I guess my comment is very much looking at a certain maybe strata of the market and who is bought at what price they're bought, and
yes, that's true.
It is not.
I can't remember. I think the most expensive painting bought by that was made by a female artist was one of the YBAs, the one who does figurative.
I think Jenny Saville.
Yeah, Jenny Saville, exactly. Yeah. But if you compare that with Peter Doig's Canoe or something, it's a fraction. It's true. But then I wonder whether this is definitely 100% important, but women have always been making art, and I think I draw great strength, for example, from my grandma, who was a seamstress and made clothes her whole life, redecorated her apartment endlessly her whole life. So there are so many ways in which all kinds of people have been so creative throughout years, and there have certainly been women artists, but yeah, it's just about pushing that, championing that, and revealing those stories of creativity.
And you're absolutely right that right now these stories are coming to the fore, and that's super encouraging. You want to do more of that, because there's so many talent. I remember you and I went to the London Art Fair a few years back, and I can't remember if it's 2 or 3 years ago, maybe more.
Yeah.
And we saw the work of Leonora Carrington there. And I had never seen, I didn't know her, I thought she was an emerging artist, and I thought, this is so incredible, there's so much richness to it. And then we wrote a bit about it, and now there's like Leonora Carrington everywhere.
Yes,
she's
I'm
a
reading
superstar.
her short stories at the moment.
So I think it's lovely to see now all this generation, and I feel like Christine is in that generation of women who were a bit left to one side, where the soulage and the combats were, you know, certainly in France at the front of the stage. But she's slightly got forgotten, and I think, you know, now it's great to see all these women and peers of her who are really coming through.
Absolutely. And it takes work to do that, you know, it takes people like you to put in that effort and to see value where it truly lies, I think.